Good day to you. This week's tutorial is designed primarily for managing agents and trustees. It's a high-level report on the National Association of Managing Agents 2011 Indaba, held in May, last week in fact, in Gauteng. This was in fact the first South African sectional title management conference ever held, and it follows on what South Africans who've gone to Australia have seen in that jurisdiction. Let me give you a quick idea of what we'll be covering, when and where it happened, the program, who was there, who sponsored the event, and some of the things that I considered were the highlights. The Ekurhuleni Conference Centre in Muldersdrift is a quite South African themed game lodge type of arrangement, very close to Lanseria Airport. It's very convenient. It's literally 20 minutes drive from Lanseria, and it's not much further from Pretoria and Johannesburg, so it's very convenient for the people who are in Gauteng. It was held on the 5th and 6th, that being a Friday and Saturday in May last week, 2011. What actually happened, I've given you the layout here. We started off with Francesco Andrioni, an Australian lawyer from Sydney, now primarily a strata title consultant and an adjunct professor at the University of Technology in Sydney, and he did a really well researched talk in which he unpacked the development of strata title in Australia over the last 50 years, picking out themes and financial things which he'd really done his homework well. He'd looked at the South African legislation, and it was a very interesting talk, giving us some idea of what we can expect. Obviously, there are differences between Australia and South Africa, and I'll touch on those in a minute. But it really was a fascinating talk. Joseph Malaluka of Ruth and Vessels then gave a talk on the Community Scheme Ombuds Service, unpacking that in not in a lot of detail, but giving a high-level overview of the Ombuds Service. Clive Ashfall's talk was interesting. You know, the EAB has been in the news a lot, but his talk, I think, restored some confidence. Clive is moving across from education and training to the role of the chief enforcer of the EAB legislation, and he gave the audience the assurance that his personal efforts, and we know that those can be very good as they have been in the past, will be applied to making sure that unregistered people don't compete with managing agents, and that the industry is properly regulated in future. We had a panel discussion in which I chaired and in which I gave the first presentation on the sectional titles schemes management bill, what will be that act. Kwesi Ngwenya and Anyan Hladi followed me. They're both legal services from the Department of Human Settlements, and they explained exactly how this thing would be implemented, and how the finances work. We got an idea from government's perspective of exactly how they see this thing being implemented. And Connie van der Merwe then did a close analysis of the existing legislation and the new legislation in regard to sectional title schemes management, highlighting the distinctions and the differences which managing agents and owners and trustees will have to deal with. On day 2, we started with Professor van der Merwe, Connie, giving a talk on sectional titles in international perspective. Again, very interesting. Justin Mason stepped in for the main sponsor, ABSA, who, whilst they put up the main sponsorship amount, didn't send a speaker in the end. So he spoke on Section 46 administrators, and particularly the difficulties that they face and schemes under administration face. He then compared that to the new legislation which will come in, and I think his general view was that things will be very much improved. Whilst all these talks were happening, there were 2 other things I want to mention. There were simultaneous workshops. Mike Addison, Tertius Marie, and Marina Constance were giving talks at the same time as some of the other discussions. And at the end of day 1, we also had Penny Haynes, a motivational speaker. She is a famous South African swimmer who has won many gold awards, and she gave a good chat. Fundamentally, she said 2 things. Pay close attention to the detail, and secondly, swim your own race. In other words, don't follow other people doing things that you think that they do well. Do what you think is right, and pay huge attention to the detail. That was her recipe for success. Who was there? Well, there were a total of about 150 people, might have been 153 or 4, but the total number, including presenters and sponsors and absolutely everybody. Now, that's not an enormous number given the size of this industry, but it, I think, was a very good turnout, especially for the first time. You'll see I've given you a list of the people who actually slept over at Ekurhuleni, but there were... There may have been more, but I know that Leisha Hodson, Karine Kotsi, and Shannon Lee Moore-Barnes were all there. I spoke to them, and I also met a lot of my other ex-students, which I thought was very nice. Who sponsored the event? The main sponsor, as I say, was ABSA. They're called the Platinum sponsor. But as you may have read in the paper, shortly after the sponsorship was awarded and before the event, ABSA curtailed their involvement in sponsorships. Things are in a cost-cutting drive, so they weren't very obvious there other than for their logo on quite a lot of things. There were a number of levy financiers and insurance companies, Corporate Insurance, Santam. Santam, I think, is by far the largest insurer against indemnity insurance against fire and other sorts of risks as are required in terms of the prescribed regulations. You then had a group of levy financiers. Stylus is the new kid on the block, owned largely by Santam and run by the same team who originally created Propel, that is Charles Coetzee and Tertius Marie. Propel has recently been sold again, so it's moving probably into a more formal part of the market, whereas Stylus is the new kid on the block, selling levy finance in the form of a guarantee insurance. There were other, as you probably know, there are lots of people who offer levy finance, including managing agents. There was also BC Bridging Solutions, and for all I know, there might have been others. The managing agents were there. Pro Admin is Gerard Joost. Bellboy is Graham Moore-Barnes' firm. Belito Estates is Barbara Shingler's. Omni Estates from Bloemfontein is also a representative, and Pretor was the one. Ashley van Grienen is the Omni Estates lady. There were attorneys and consultants who both had little trade shows and were working the floor, as it were. The BBM is in fact Marina Constas, and it was the only law firm, as I recall, that was there. Confero is a new kid in the block there. That's Amelia Steyn, who's been closely involved with NAMA, and she was with Mid-City for many years. She's left them, joined a group, financial services group called Confero, and is now concentrating on sectional title training and consulting. There were various service supply control people who would control electricity flow or water flow, and who were showing what they could do in terms of these things. We know we have to be careful with this because you can't simply remove somebody's flow of water or electricity on constitutional grounds. You can't do that. And this was the one. In fact, now we've touched on both levy finance and service supply control. Francesco Andreani was interested to see these things, which he'd never seen in Australia before. In Australia, if a body corporate wants to borrow money, they can do so at normal commercial rates. It's not much more expensive. It's not more expensive at all than an overdraft. Whereas, of course, the situation is different in South Africa. And the service supply thing he hadn't seen in this context before. There were maintenance, security, and other people. There were Curisure, Qualitech, ADT were represented. iPortals, I didn't actually see, and perhaps they might not have actually turned up. But there were a lot of people. What I think were the highlights? Well, in my view, Francesco's talk was an absolute highlight. As I've said before, I think it was brilliant. I thought that the fact that the government actually came, they stayed for the full 2 days, listened to everything, and certainly Claudia told me afterwards that he thought he'd learnt a lot about the industry from being there for those 2 days, talking to people and listening. They gave some awards to Elmo Stewart, Marina Constance, Justin Mason, Tertius Marie, and myself, on the basis that we were people who'd been around for a long time and had supported NAMA's establishment and endeavours. I also thought Clive's EAB presentation was important. It gave clarity to an area which we've been worried about. Nobody was sure whether the EAB were going to saddle this horse and ride it or just abandon it. It's clear now they're going to saddle the horse and ride it. So I think that we must look at the EAB with new eyes. As far as having a national conference, this was NAMA's proof of concept. Would it work? And whilst the numbers could have been bigger, the spirit was high. People, I think, learned a lot, and I thought it was a thorough success. I was pleased to see everybody talking, discussing, and even arguing about things. And there was talk of future conferences. So next time there's one of these things, I suggest you go. If you're anywhere in Gauteng, you certainly should go. And if it might well be worth your while going up to them, even if you're not in Gauteng. Thank you for watching this Paddocks Club tutorial, and I hope to hear from you in the discussion forum.